Okay, so before I get too far, I do want to mention that both the intro Psalms notes for, or Lord willing, next week, or midway through that class, if we get that far, both the intro notes for Psalms as well as the next week notes for Psalms are both on the back table. So after service, feel free to pick up one of those because we will be getting into Psalms soon. So, as we are in Job chapter 3, we noted last week as we ended after Job, the events of Job chapter 2, how that Job had to kind of bring back some objectivity and perspective to his wife, after his wife, certainly after going through all of this, is at a point where it sounds as if she's at a point where she's about to give up. And she kind of suggests that Job do the same. Job refuses to. He says, shall we accept good and not accept adversity? Both are going to come. And that's not the issue. The issue is how we're going to deal with it. Then at the end of chapter 2, we noticed how that Job's friends came. They didn't recognize him at first. They could barely tell it was him. And of course, they're with him for 7 days, and they're in complete silence. It is a mourning period for Job, and as his three friends are there with him, sitting with him, there's not really anything they can say, so they're silent right there with him. And then here in Job chapter 3, Job starts kind of pouring out his heart. And we noticed here in verse 11 how that all this is kind of culminated. Everything he said up to verse 11 is, why was I even born? And then here in verse 11, why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me? Why the breast that I should nurse? For now I have lain still and been quiet. I would have been asleep, and then I would have been at rest. And so all of this he describes that everything that he has gone through has made him, has put him to a point where it's almost as if he longs for that state of not having been born or having died at birth or having to be at rest is his idea. And of course he's not dying, and the devil can't cause him to die either. Because God told him that the one limitation that God gave Satan was, you can't kill him. And so all of this that Job is going through is kind of an extended torture. And again, keep in mind that this is not just 2 or 3 or 4 days. This is taking place over probably several weeks from chapter 1 to chapter 3. All of this at least probably 2 weeks at the very least. I mean, just between the end of chapter 2 and the start of chapter 3, 1 week passed. So you got to figure there's some time that is going along here. And it could be even as much as a couple of months. We're not really given any particular timeline to understand how long Job is having to go through this. But he is now at this point where, and in chapter 3 here, he doesn't question God. He doesn't curse God. He doesn't sin in any way. What he's saying here is really just, it's the despair that is in his heart and in his soul that he is describing here. Verse 21, who long for death, but it does not come, and search for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they can find the grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes before I eat, and my groanings pour out like water. For the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes. And this suggests that, we talked before about of all the diseases that the devil could have picked, he chose this one. And I don't know if this has any connection, verse 24 and 25. It sounds as if there was something that Job really didn't want to have to go through. Okay, whether that had something to do with his children, whether it had to do with his health, maybe specifically boils being an issue, whatever it was, the thing that I greatly feared has come upon me. That again, Job, it wasn't like he was protected in that he hadn't faced any adversity at all. I tend to think that he must have had a little bit, just certainly nothing like this, and probably nothing so difficult that it could have possibly be a threat to his faith. But having said that, he's not unaware of the suffering that other people go through. And, and we all probably have certain things that we maybe there's something that we saw or heard about when we were growing up that kind of just stuck with us. One particular fear, whether it's for ourselves or for our loved ones, there's one thing that we really hope we don't have to go through. And it sounds as if Job, in some way, and again, whether this has to do with his boils or the loss of his children or his livelihood, whatever it was, it sounds as if, verse 25, and it may be all together, this great, huge trial, maybe generically, that Job is referring to, but he specifically says, that which I've greatly feared, it has come. Whether it's, again, general adversity or the specific adversity of what he's facing, it's upon him. What I dreaded has happened to me. Okay, so this is Job, and he's just pouring out his heart. And of course, here in a little bit, his friends are going to start chiming in a little bit. And the first two are going to offer to Job, listen, we love you. But you know what? No one's perfect, and everybody falls short, and you must have done something bad because God is punishing you. That's just all there is to it. And so over the next several chapters, there is this back and forth. In fact, in your notes, you got first round, second round, so forth, of kind of this going back and forth between the first two friends of Job. And then the third one, Eliphaz, who is younger and yet actually a little bit wiser. He corrects, starting in chapter 31, he corrects both his friends and Job's friends, the other two, because they have the wrong idea. But he also corrects Job for some of the things that he felt Job was saying that weren't accurate. And he still, even Eliphaz, is still trying to convince Job, there has to be something. Okay, even Eliphaz, despite the fact he's a little wiser than his two older friends, he still has the wrong idea as well. So anything through chapter 3 and all the way up to chapter 37, because we're going to pick up in we're going to pick up in chapter 37. But if anybody has already read this, and again, I apologize that we're not going to spend a lot of time going through the dialogue between the friends. If you want to go through that, you can. But it's this kind of constant back and forth, and there's no irritation from Job that he expresses to his friends, really. It's frustration over the situation, and eventually, especially after Eliphaz chimes in, before and after, both Eliphaz that chimes in, that's when Job starts questioning when he really kind of calls upon God, is it really wise to allow a righteous man to suffer in this way? That's where chapter 38, that God gets involved. And it's only at that point that God gets involved. Nowhere up through the first three chapters does God speak to Job. Whether God had spoken to Job before these events, we're never told. Based on his reaction in chapter 42, it seems as if, it doesn't seem like there's some unbelievable event that Job has a hard time accepting that God's talking to him. So it may be that God has spoken to him in the past. It's possible. But up through chapter 3, there is no dialogue between God and Job. And all the way up to chapter 38, starting with God speaking to Job. Any thoughts or questions through? And again, I wanted to focus on Job 3 because these are his initial feelings. After 7 days of not talking with his friends, these are the first things that he says. And to me, that has some importance, that these are the first words that he chose to say after 7 days. This is what's weighing heavily on his heart.
So do you think that maybe that's part of the dread is the thoughts and like not necessarily he's kind of questioning God. That next part where you were just saying that he was discussing with his friends.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's the dread that he never wanted to happen?
I don't think at this point, because I think Job eventually gets to the part where he's questioning God's wisdom based on this constant back and forth from his friends. I don't think he's quite there yet. I tend to think verse 25 and 26, the source of his trouble, the source of the fact that he has no rest, it has to do, certainly with his physical ailments, the boils, has to do with his children, having died, his livelihood gone, his wife has kind of turned against him. All of this, whether it's all kind of as one big thing that it's testing him, that could be, in a broad sense, or any one of those specific things that took place, something that he was scared to death, that he didn't want to happen, and here it has happened. And again, why did the devil choose boils specifically? It's possible maybe that's one thing that Job that's the worst thing he could possibly think of that could ever happen to him. And so the devil chose to do that to him. And whether that's specifically it or not, I don't know, but that would go a long way into explaining why boils when he could have chosen anything else, and he chose boils. Yes, ma'am? Yeah, that's exactly what he's describing. This is my worst nightmare. It would have been better if I died at birth, because, all this stuff that I'm going through, and I don't know if I don't know if this is thinking too much about it, but we know that babies are innocent, okay? Children, babies have no opportunity to fall away because they have no knowledge of right and wrong. They have no capability of understanding right and wrong. And so now Job, who is an adult and he knows right and wrong, in addition to the obvious aspect of, why didn't I just die at birth? I wish I didn't have to go through this now. There could be an additional layer to this, in addition to the physical issues that he's dealing with, the trial of faith. If I had died as a baby, there would be no question. There would be no trial. There would be no possibility of not making it to heaven. And now he's having to go through all of this, and it is a trial. It is a test. And so that could be an element to this as well, that he wished he had died at birth, because then heaven would be, there's no possibility of being sinful as a baby. Any thoughts or questions through chapter 3?
There could also be that element of, we hear this all the time. People who are living but not living. They look like they're living as if they're not living.
Yeah.
Rather they have a major trauma or something. It would have been better for Job if he had been with his kids when they were.
Right.
So now maybe that's what he dreaded.
It could be.
I'm living and I'm not living.
Right. Being in a state where... Right. And death to be quick and relatively painless. That is, death's going to come to us all, and we can only pray that might be the way in which we end up going, is something that is relatively quick and relatively painless, both for ourselves and most especially for our family. And Job, not only does he feel like this is drawn out, but we know that it could keep on going indefinitely as long as God allows it to continue, because the devil has the ability to make this drawn out. He can't kill him, but he can make him suffer. Ben? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, and that's kind of what his wife suggested, Yeah, I think it's amazing that, because even when his friends come to him and are questioning him, well, what about this, Job? What about this, Job? Job continues to say, no, I haven't sinned. Okay? And again, that goes back to the mindset of the society at the time, was anytime something bad happens, God's punishing you because you did something wrong. But even today, I think sometimes even Christians can get into the habit of thinking that anytime things don't go quite our way, or things don't work out the way we thought or had hoped they would, or something terrible, tragic happens, that God He's punishing us. Sometimes the thought process or the temptation to think that way exists for us. And to me, it's a great lesson from Job is his insistence, not blind insistence, not stubbornness in the fact that he refuses to accept that he's done something wrong or something like that. No, he was that aware of his actions, that aware of his words in relation to what God's law was, that he knew that there was nothing that he had done that was the source of all of this. There was nothing that Job, not that Job would say he was perfect, because I'm sure he wasn't, but that there was nothing left unsacrificed or repentant or anything like that that would bring about this anger or wrath from God. And Job, even in the midst of his friends trying to tell him, Job, it has to be, Job continues to say, no, there's not. And just think about being that aware. Half the time, maybe we're at work, we're at school, we get home, and maybe we're thinking about the day, and all of a sudden something occurs to us that we may have said or have done that either maybe wasn't sinful, but may have been a bad example, or may have given the wrong impression of us, or something along that line. And because things, sometimes you get caught up in the moment and you don't really think about what you're doing or what you're saying sometimes. But Job was aware of himself enough to say, there was nothing I've done that would warrant the wrath of God on me. So all of this is not about that. And that's ultimately what causes his error, because ultimately he does question God. God, I haven't done anything wrong, so why are you allowing these things to happen? God, I haven't done anything wrong. Is it wise to allow these things, and not so much bad things, but the depth of the terrible things that have happened to Job? And not necessarily even just the depth, but the prolonged period under which he's going as well. Because keep in mind, both in chapter 1 and chapter 2, when these terrible things happened, his initial response wasn't, God, I thought you were going to protect me because I've been faithful to you. That's not what he said. Okay? He said we accept good from God. We need to be able to accept adversity. He's not backtracking later as he gets into chapters 37 and so forth. He's not backtracking. But instead, it's the depth of his despair, the depth of his torture that makes him question, okay, don't you think I've had enough, God? Is it really wise to let someone righteous go through such a tremendous trial as this that seems overwhelming? And I'm sure it did. I'm sure it seemed overwhelming. I'm sure it seemed impossible for him to overcome as the days wore on. And that's the one area where God had to correct Job. And you look at it in that light, and you remind yourself that Job is human. How would I react in this situation? And we're going to see here in chapter 38, you might think God's response, there's a little bit of sarcasm from God in chapter 38 and chapter 39 when he responds to Job. And it's a little harsh from that perspective. And it kind of makes you think, that maybe, is that a little unfair? He's been faithful, and it's just it's been wearing him. His friends have worn him down. All of this that's happened is just a huge burden on him. And now he doesn't even curse God. He just questions God, is it really wise to let a righteous man suffer like this? And that's where God comes in and corrects him. But again, what does Paul remind the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 10? About temptation. God will never allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. Beyond what you're able. And which suggests what about God's confidence in Job's faith? You can handle it, Job. And so often we don't think we can. Okay, some of the things that we face in this life, the despair, the sorrow, sometimes something happens, we think it's just going to overwhelm us. That I can't handle this. I can't do this. But that just goes to show that God knows us far better than we know ourselves. That He knows you can. Because He would never put on you more than what you're able to deal with. All right, anything else through chapter 3? All right, we're going to skip ahead. Job We're going to go to chapter 30. We're going to pick up in 37 and get into chapter 38. So this is as Elihu comes on the scene here in chapter 36. Elihu is speaking. He's trying to talk to Job about some of these issues. Verse 24, he reminds Job about the majesty of God. God is great. But again, it's still within this context of God is aware of all things. God sees everything, and He is able to correct things and bring about judgment on people who aren't doing what they should do, and so forth. So here in verse 30, or chapter 37 rather, we're going to pick up in verse 10. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen. Also with moisture, he saturates the thick clouds. He scatters his bright clouds, and they swirl about, being turned by his guidance, that they may do whatever he commands them on the face of the whole earth. He causes it to come, whether for correction, or for his land, or for mercy. Listen to this, O Job. Stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know when God dispatches them and causes the light of his cloud to shine? Do you know how the clouds are balanced, those wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? Why are your garments hot when he quiets the earth by the south wind? With him have you spread out the skies, strong as a cast metal mirror? Teach us what we should say to him, for we can prepare nothing because of the darkness. Should he be told that I wish to speak? If a man were to speak, surely he would be swallowed up. Even now, men cannot look at the light when it is bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. He comes from the north as golden splendor, with God as awesome majesty. As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is excellent in power and judgment and abundant justice. He does not oppress, therefore men fear him. He shows no partiality to any who are wise of heart. You read through chapter 37, and Elihu's words, there's really nothing in there that you would say, well, I disagree with that. Okay, his words, they sound good. But keep in mind, this is in the context of Elihu trying to help Job come to terms with the fact that, Job, how can you really know that you didn't do anything wrong? And that's the point that he's making. For instance, when he says, as for the Almighty, we cannot find him, and he describes his judgment and his justice and so forth, it's impossible to know all of this for sure, Job, whether you truly are righteous in his sight. He describes God, and the way he describes God is fine. It's just interesting that a lot of the things that he says, he's challenging Job to a certain extent. Job, you've made these statements, and I'm going to talk about God and how wonderful he is, but also how powerful, how he can bring, we see correction, using the forces of nature and so forth. At no point does it enter any of this dialogue the possibility, well, maybe God isn't doing this to you. Maybe he's allowing this to happen. That was never in the thoughts of his friends at all. It's always God's doing this to you, as opposed to God's allowing it to happen, knowing that you have been righteous. That is not a thought process in their mind. This doesn't correlate. And so all of this, even Elihu's words, again, his thought process about God, and there's a lot of praise elements in there. They're accurate based on what he says. It's how he's using it with Job that kind of goes a little bit off the mark. So when we go to chapter 38, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. Now, a lot of times we focus on how God is talking to Job, what he says, but we forget the manner in which he presents himself. And that's interesting because what was it that killed his children? It was a whirlwind. Okay, so here's a whirlwind. At some point, after Elihu's dialogue here, at some point, whether God is answering based on what Job has said already over the previous 30 chapters, or there's some dialogue we're missing between, what Job, as he's praying to God or something between chapter 37 and 38, and God is actually coming in person to respond, or at least he's going to speak from the whirlwind to respond to Job. And so here's this whirlwind. He's going to talk to Job and says in verse 2, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me." God has mentioned, this was brought up, verse 2, earlier in Job as well. And a lot of times you get the impression that he's thinking, or that God is referring to those who darken counsel, which is to say they don't fully understand. Words without knowledge. You don't understand. And when you go back earlier in Job and you see this mentioned, you assume or think, well, maybe this is about the friends. Because obviously the friends don't have a full understanding of God, and Job has the better understanding of God. But in fact, as we read down into chapter 42, Job quotes this referring to himself. Okay, so when he says, "You have asked of me," okay, Job says, "I recognize that you're saying this about me." That Job was the one who's darkening counsel by words without knowledge. That there was a lot that Job didn't understand, but it was that fact that caused him to be in this scenario here that God's having to correct him. Because Job wanted to know. And that was the problem. It wasn't that he didn't know, but he needed to, and God hadn't revealed it to him. No. Job had no right to ask in the first place. Okay? It's one thing to speculate, it's another thing to wonder, but Job is asking over and over, "God, where's the wisdom? God, why is this happening? God, is it wise to let this happen?" And so finally God is responding here. "Prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." In verse 3, I'm just picturing Job just kind of nodding, "Yes, sir." God's talking to you out of tornado. You're going to, "Yes, sir." In verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" You can hear, and again, you read this verse 4 and 5. Surely you know, he says. There's that sarcasm to a certain extent there, but it's directed specifically at the wisdom element that Job has been questioning. Because the questions that God is posing to Job, if Job has the right to question the wisdom of God, then that surely must mean Job himself must have great wisdom and understanding. But does anybody have wisdom and understanding like God? So God, when he goes through all of this, he is reminding Job, "Job, who are you to question my wisdom?" And that's why he's posing these questions the way he does. He doesn't want that lesson to be lost on Job. He wants him to understand. And so here in verse 8, "Who shut the sea with the doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb?" And of course, what's God going back to? What is all of this going back to? Creation. Yeah, creating the earth, creating the heavens, creating the sea and the clouds. It says in verse 12, have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it may take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? It takes on form like clay under a seal, and stands out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and the upraised arm is broken. So after creation, what does God say he's continued to do? What is God maintaining? Yeah, nature of the earth. Okay, he's describing the coming of the sun. He's describing all of this that he says in verse 12. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Every cycle that has been designed by God in nature, God not only started it, but there is, to a certain extent, an element of God's continuing preserving of it, of maintaining it, of keeping it going. So when he says in verse 22, verse 21, do you know it because you were born then, or because the number of your days is great? Have you entered the treasury of snow? Have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? Treasury of snow, treasury of hail. And of course, it's God speaking to the abundance of which God, through nature, can bring all of that upon earth. Verse 24, by what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered over the earth? Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man? You know that classic question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it happen? Does it? It does. Who is there to hear it? God. It rains in a land where there is no man. Does it actually rain? Yeah, it does. Verse 27, to satisfy the desolate waste, to cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass. Has the rain a father? Or who has begotten the drops of dew? Verse 31, can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades, or loosen the belt of Orion? Can you bring out Mazzaroth in its season? Can you guide the great bear with its cubs? What's God describing now? Constellations. Constellations. These kind of formations of stars that we call constellations is kind of how we keep track, and how man has always kept track of this, in many ways, of the seasons. Okay, kind of keeping track of the days and the seasons and how what's taking place in the universe and things around us. You know, as understanding started to really kind of pick up, and really in the last 500 years, learning more and more about space around us. God is the one who created it all and causes it to be maintained. Verse 33, do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? Verse 36, who has put wisdom in the mind? Who has given understanding to the heart? What separates us from any other animal on earth? Sorry? Spirit, conscience, we have a soul. We're able to determine right and wrong, aren't we? Isn't that what it's boiled down to? We're able to know right and wrong. Okay? Monkeys and dogs and other relatively intelligent animals, they can't understand right and wrong. They can understand, oh no, I made my master mad. Maybe almost a childlike type of understanding where I don't really know what it was I did, but he didn't like the fact that I chewed up that toy or that shoe or whatever. Okay? But to understand the deeper elements of where right and wrong comes from, to wonder about the afterlife, all of this, they're not capable of that. Only humans are, because God made us that way. Verse 39, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? When they crouch in their dens or lurk in their lairs to lie in wait? Who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God and wonder about for lack of food? Is God mindful even of the animals that He's created? When you think about, especially verse 41, what passage in the New Testament do you think about? What comes to mind? Matthew chapter 6, right? Do not worry. And then he describes how that, the birds of the air, they don't work, and yet God provides for them. Aren't you of more value than they? Okay? God cares about all His creation. He has designed systems within the creation to provide for all of nature, but especially man. But it's interesting because you think, okay, as of really verse 20, God's made His point, but God doesn't end there. He continues here in chapter 39. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? He goes through talking about, again, nature. Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he bed by your manger? Verse 19, have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Verse 26, does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Chapter 40, moreover, the Lord said to Job, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. So how did God perceive the questioning of his wisdom by Job? What was Job doing? I don't think he meant to, but what was Job doing? He was contending. He was contending with God. And that's what God brings up here in verse 40. So in verse 3, Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. And so the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, now prepare yourself like a man. Verse 8, would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like his? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor and array yourself with glory and beauty. So now here in chapter 40, God's dealing with his nature, God's nature. Okay, not just with what he's done, creating everything and taking care of all the systems of the earth and the animals of the earth, but now here in verse 40, notice how God deals specifically with man. Look on everyone who is proud and humble him, verse 11. Verse 15, look now at the behemoth which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See, his strength is in his hips and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. Bones like the beams of bronze. His ribs like the bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. Verse 24, though he takes in the eyes of one pierces his nose with a snare, describing this behemoth, whatever that behemoth may have been. The way God describes it, it doesn't necessarily describe anything we have today living. Maybe in the past it did. But what God describes is his wisdom in dealing with man. If you are like me in your wisdom and understanding, then you should be able to deal with things like this. You should know everything there is to know about the behemoth. You should know all there is to know about creation. But Job doesn't. All right, we will stop there at chapter 40. We will pick up chapter 41 and chapter 42 next week. I apologize. Our goal will still be to finish Job next Wednesday night. If we get through with all of it and we still have time left in class, we'll go ahead and start Psalms. If not, then we'll pick up Psalms the next week. But absolutely, without doubt, Job will end next week. And again, let me remind you, we have the notes on the back table, both for the first study, which is the introductory notes, and then part 2 notes. It even says part 2 underneath the heading for the next couple of weeks for Psalms. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughts and comments.